Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving into one of those ancient mysteries that really sparks endless curiosity, the Nephilim. You've likely encountered the term. It's often linked to giants, or these mysterious offspring mentioned in really old text. Now, the most widespread belief, people often call it the angelic view, suggests that angels actually, procreated with human women, and that this led to these powerful Nephilim figures. But here's our mission for this deep dive. We're taking your sources, specifically looking at Samuel Delgado's The Nephilim Myth, Physical Limitations of Angels, to really explore the critical arguments he raises. We kind of want to challenge that popular angelic view with some, frankly, surprising facts and a good dose of logical scrutiny straight from the material itself.
Yeah, and what's so striking about this source is how it doesn't just offer an alternative idea. It carefully spells out what it considers hurdles too great to overcome for that angelic view. It really forces you, the reader, to examine the deep implications of this belief, especially when you think about the physical capabilities of angels and humans and, even the fundamental nature of life itself. So yeah, this deep dive is definitely going to challenge some common assumptions and provide a pretty robust counter-perspective, I think.
Okay, so Delgado's work really begins by nailing down a core problem for this angelic view.
Yeah.
The very physical limitations of angels. He challenges us, asking, can angels even take on physical form to begin with, let alone procreate? And what he highlights is that while, yes, good angels did take on physicality, remember by God's direct command in Genesis 18 and 19, those three men visiting Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
What's crucial, he argues, is that we see no instance, nowhere in the Bible, where a fallen angel, one who rebels against God, is actually shown to take on physicality. That's a huge distinction, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And, if we drill down into the biblical evidence presented, it seems to explicitly refute the notion of angelic procreation in several ways. One foundational principle is what the Bible calls kinds. It's essentially God's design that living things reproduce after their own nature, their own kind. So Genesis 1.25, for instance, it says, God made the beast of the earth after his kind. Simple enough. But then 1 Corinthians 15.3940 sort of extends this idea to different types of bodies. You've got human, animal, and even celestial bodies, and it distinguishes between them.
Okay.
The implication being, just like birds and fish can't create hybrids, well, neither can humans and angels. They're fundamentally different kinds of flesh, according to this view. But maybe the strongest piece of evidence presented comes from Jesus himself. Matthew 22.30. He tells us that in the resurrection, angels neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are as the angels of God in heaven. So, if they don't marry, well, their inability to procreate is certainly implied there. And another point the source brings up, there are simply no female angels mentioned anywhere in the Bible, which kind of makes the whole premise of angels procreating seem contrary to their very nature described in the text.
That's a lot of biblical evidence stacked against the idea. But what about the counter-argument? You hear this one a lot. Fallen angels are rebellious, right? They don't follow God's rules. So wouldn't that make Jesus' statement about angels in heaven kind of irrelevant to them? How does Delgado tackle that?
That's a really common objection, and it's central to what Delgado addresses. He argues that Jesus wasn't just talking about good versus bad angels there. Instead, Jesus was making a distinction between two kinds of realities, heaven and earth. The suggestion is that in the resurrection, humans will be like all the angels, not making a distinction based on their allegiance. But maybe more fundamentally, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the source argues the angelic view inadvertently kind of glorifies Satan and his angels.
How so?
Well, it almost makes it seem like God needs to adjust his plan because of their unforeseen rebellion, But the source emphasizes that the Bible consistently shows God's absolute control over Satan. It fundamentally challenges that idea that fallen angels could just unilaterally derail God's plans to such a massive degree.
Yeah. Okay, give me some examples from the text.
Sure. Think about it. Right from the fall in Genesis, God immediately sets limits on the serpent. Or look at Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. Jesus dismisses Satan, and then there's the beginning of the millennium in Revelation, where an angel binds Satan, shows clear authority.
Right.
Even look at the book of Job. God explicitly permits but also limits Satan's actions. Only upon himself put not forth thine hand, and later save his life. God's setting the boundaries.
Got it.
There's also that interesting comparison with David's census. One passage credits God, another credits Satan. The interpretation offered is that Satan was acting as a tool in God's hand, even then. And maybe even Jesus directing Judas in John 13.27 that thou doest, do quickly. It suggests even Satan's influence on Judas ultimately served God's sovereign purpose.
So it's not like God is caught off guard.
Exactly. The argument is that his sovereignty is always paramount. So according to the source, the Bible just doesn't really allow for angels to act out against God and his creation in the specific way the angelic view proposes, like creating a whole new hybrid race.
Okay, so we've covered the kind of big theological and biblical hurdles. But Delgado's source doesn't stop there, does it? It really starts to dig into the practical, almost, well, common sense questions about how this angelic human procreation would even work. And honestly, that's where the angelic view starts to face some seriously strange logistical challenges, according to the author. Like, okay, some might argue Jesus was only talking about marriage, not sex. But the source counters that, arguing it kind of goes against God's character to create angels that have the ability to have sex without marriage. That's a character argument. And it's also worth noting, right, Genesis 6.4 actually states the sons of God took them wives. That sounds like marriage, not just, casual procreation.
That's a fair point from the text.
Then you get into the truly practical questions the source raises. Like, if angels take on flesh, would semen just manifest out of nowhere? And how could a human female even carry a giant, potentially, to term? I mean, biologically.
Yeah, the physical realities become quite problematic.
You start picturing some of these scenarios, and it quickly moves from maybe biblical mystery into something that feels more like, I don't know, a fantasy novel.
It does strain credibility when you think through the mechanics.
It just adds so many layers of how could that even happen? And the logistical issues, the source points out, extend to the offspring themselves. How do the giant offspring procreate? Would it be like a giant male with a human female? Or a human male with a giant female? Or giant mating with giant?
Right, the downstream implications.
Yeah, the source basically concludes that the more we begin to ask these questions, the more this seems more like a fantasy than reality. And, another good question raised, why would the result be giants anyway? Why not something like, I don't know, angelic like humans, more subtle?
And that whole line of questioning leads to an even more profound theological issue, which the source really emphasizes. This raises an important question. If this union did occur, how could fallen angels and humans not only create a body, but a soul and spirit?
Creation of life itself.
Precisely. John 1.4 states, "The Word gave life to everything that was created. Life comes from God." This issue is so tricky, apparently, that some proponents of the angelic view, like Doug Hamp and Tom Horn mentioned in the source, they propose this bodysuit or avatar theory.
Okay, what's that?
Well, the idea is they suggest angels didn't actually procreate biologically to create new life forms. Instead, they simply, took on physical forms or maybe inhabited existing bodies, almost like wearing a temporary avatar.
Okay. So they're not really creating the Nephilim life.
That's the theory. But
Yeah.
the source critiques this pretty heavily. For one thing, it would imply a really limited number of Nephilim, right? Maybe just the 200 fallen angels mentioned in the Book of Enoch, if you use that text.
Right. Not a widespread corruption.
Exactly. And more importantly, it directly contradicts that core angelic view narrative that all mankind, except Noah's family, was somehow corrupted genetically. If angels only inhabited bodies, then humans aren't genetically corrupted, are they? And angels themselves cannot multiply in this scenario.
Okay, I see the conflict.
Yeah, it completely breaks down the argument that the seed of the Messiah was under threat through genetic contamination. The source basically says it's illogical if you try to hold both ideas.
So, wow. Okay, what does this all mean when you pull it all together? When you look at all the arguments laid out in the Nephilim myth, it becomes pretty clear, at least according to Delgado, that the angelic view faces, well, too many hurdles to overcome, just one thing after another.
It's a cumulative case.
And the source points out these, unanswerable, purely hypothetical questions that just naturally arise from this whole premise. Questions like, what is the eternal fate for those hybrids? Does this mean that a human soul is damned because of the fallen angel aspect of it? Does it mean that a fallen angel soul can be redeemed because of its human aspect? Is it even possible for two souls to somehow exist independently within one of these hybrids? I mean, it gets really weird really fast.
Deep theological waters there.
Yeah, and Delgado's position is pretty firm in the end. The simple answer, he writes, is that this entire scenario is not possible, based on his reading of the scriptures and logic.
I think a key takeaway from Delgado's analysis here is how a really deep dive into the source material, into the Bible itself, reveals that a seemingly mysterious passage,
Hmm.
well, it can potentially be understood without resorting to lots of extra speculation or bringing in non-biblical sources. This kind of rigorous analysis really encourages, I think, understanding God's word more deeply on its own terms and maybe avoiding some endless speculation.
So here's something to think about as we wrap up. Knowing what you now know about these arguments against the angelic view laid out by Delgado, what other historical or maybe mythological explanations for giants in the earth, because the phrase is right there in Genesis, might you now re-examine with perhaps a more critical lens? Maybe consider the intellectual discipline involved in seeking clear, biblically supported answers versus, maybe embracing more sensational interpretations, and how that kind of thinking applies not just here, but to understanding any complex subject, really. Food for thought.